The American sergeant walked past the pile without a second glance. Lieutenant Werner Krebs, standing behind the wire fence of the prisoner compound at Camp Shanks, New York, watched the man toss a pair of boots onto what looked like a garbage heap. The boots were worn, certainly. The leather showed creases and scuff marks. The soles had thinned from months of marching. But they were still boots, functional boots. Boots that could be resoled, restitched, made serviceable for another 6 months at least. Krebs had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939. He had fought in Poland, in France, in Russia. He had been captured in Normandy in August of 1944, shipped across the Atlantic, and deposited in this camp 30 miles north of New York City. In his 6 years of military service, he had never seen a soldier simply throw away boots. In Germany, worn boots were returned to depot for repair. The leather was too valuable. The labor invested in their construction was too significant. Material was too scarce. But here, on this cold morning in January 1945, he was watching American soldiers discard equipment as if it had no value at all. The pile contained not just boots, but also uniforms with minor tears, canteens with small dents, wool blankets that looked perfectly adequate, mess kits that needed only cleaning. An American private added a field jacket to the heap. The jacket's zipper was broken. Just the zipper. The rest of the jacket was intact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Krebs turned to Feldwebel Hans Mueller, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who stood beside him. "They're throwing away equipment," Krebs said. Mueller had been watching too. His face showed no expression, but his eyes tracked every item added to the pile. "I've been here 2 months," Mueller said quietly. "I've seen them do this every week. They bring in trucks. They haul it all away. Somewhere there must be a warehouse the size of a city filled with worn boots and broken zippers." That night in the barracks, Krebs couldn't stop thinking about the boots. In Russia, he had seen German soldiers wrap their feet in newspaper when their boots fell apart. He had seen men trade their watches for a pair of boots taken from a dead Soviet soldier. He had personally worn the same boots for 14 months, having them resoled 3 times. The leather patched and repatched until they barely resembled their original form. His unit's cobbler, a man from Bavaria who had worked in a shoe factory before the war, had performed miracles keeping the company's footwear functional. The cobbler had explained the economics. Leather was rationed in Germany. The cattle herds had been depleted. What leather existed went first to U-boat crews and pilots, then to Wehrmacht infantry, then to everyone else. Civilian shoe production had been restricted since 1940. By 1943, civilians were limited to 1 pair of shoes per person per year, and those shoes contained wooden soles because leather was simply unavailable. The boots the American sergeant had discarded would have been treasured in Germany. They would have been repaired and issued to another soldier. When they finally became unrepairable, the leather would have been salvaged for patches. Nothing would have been wasted. But the Americans threw them away as casually as a man might discard an apple core. The difference between what Werner Krebs had witnessed and what he had been told about America was so vast that it created a kind of cognitive dissonance he struggled to process. For 5 years, German propaganda had painted a specific picture of the United States. The Americans were soft, decadent, obsessed with luxury and comfort. Their society was divided by class warfare and racial strife. Their industrial capacity was overstated, their military incompetent, their soldiers cowardly. More importantly, Germany's leadership had insisted that the Reich's organizational efficiency and technological superiority would overcome any American numerical advantages. German quality would defeat Allied quantity. This was not merely propaganda, it was doctrine, repeated at every level from Hitler's headquarters down to company commanders in the field. The German soldier was better trained, better led, and fighting for a higher purpose. The Americans were mongrels, their army a collection of immigrants and minorities who lacked the cohesion and fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht. Werner Krebs had believed this, at least partially. Most German soldiers did. The evidence of their early victories seemed to confirm it. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. France, the great military power that had fought Germany to a standstill in the previous war, had collapsed in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht had driven to the gates of Moscow. These victories proved German superiority, or so it seemed. But the propaganda had been carefully selective in what it revealed and what it concealed. German soldiers knew their own material situation intimately because they lived it every day. By 1943, the average German infantry division was chronically short of everything. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was precious. Food rations had been reduced repeatedly. The ersatz economy, the substitution economy, had become total. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Ersatz leather made from fish skin and paper fiber. Ersatz rubber made from synthetic buna that cracked in cold weather. Ersatz wool blended with wood fiber that provided little warmth. The word ersatz had entered common usage because substitution had become the defining characteristic of German wartime production. When you couldn't get real materials, you used substitutes. When substitutes weren't available, you made do without. The German boot was a case study in this substitution. Economy. The classic jack boot, the Marschstiefel, required approximately 3 square meters of leather per pair. With leather in short supply, the Wehrmacht had transitioned to ankle boots with canvas gaiters, reducing leather usage by half. Even these were in short supply by the war's middle years. Soldiers repaired their boots obsessively. Every unit had cobblers who worked constantly. Wooden nails replaced metal ones. Rubber soles were patched with leather scraps. Canvas was reinforced with whatever material could be scavenged. The quality of German military boots declined as the war progressed. Pre-war boots, made from genuine leather with proper construction, could last 18 months of hard service. By 1943, newly issued boots might last 6 months before requiring major repairs. By 1944, the boots issued to replacement units sometimes fell apart within weeks. The leather was of poor quality, the stitching inadequate, the soles too thin. This material scarcity extended to everything. German soldiers were issued 1 wool uniform for winter and 1 cotton uniform for summer. When these wore out, replacements came slowly, if at all. Men patched their uniforms repeatedly. Holes were darned, tears were stitched, worn fabric was reinforced until the garment barely held together. The concept of discarding a repairable uniform was unthinkable. Food rations told the same story of scarcity and careful allocation. The official Wehrmacht ration in 1944 provided approximately 2,800 calories per day for frontline troops. This was adequate for men engaged in moderate activity, barely adequate for combat operations. But the official ration was often theoretical. Supply disruptions, partisan attacks on rail lines, Allied bombing of marshalling yards, and the general chaos of retreat meant that units frequently received less than the official allocation. German soldiers became experts at supplementing their rations through foraging, trading with civilians, or requisitioning from occupied territories. The practice was so common that it had its own verb, organisieren, to organize, which was military slang for acquiring supplies through unofficial channels. A good soldier was one who could organisieren extra food, better equipment, or scarce ammunition. The contrast with the German home front was even more severe. Civilian rations in Germany by 1944 had been reduced to starvation levels in many cities. The official ration provided approximately 1,500 calories per day, and even this was not always available. Meat was scarce. Butter was a luxury. Bread was the staple, and even bread was rationed. German civilians stood in long queues for basic necessities. They saved everything, repaired everything, wasted nothing. This culture of scarcity had been developing for years. Even before the war, Germany had faced resource constraints. The nation lacked sufficient domestic oil.
Production. It imported much of its food. Its access to rubber, copper, and other strategic materials was limited. The four-year plan, initiated in 1936, had attempted to make Germany self-sufficient through synthetic production and careful resource management. The plan had achieved some success. German chemists had developed synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. German engineers had designed weapons and vehicles that used minimal strategic materials. But these solutions were partial and inadequate. Synthetic production could not fully replace natural materials. Conservation could not create abundance. The result was a German war economy built on the assumption of scarcity. Everything was rationed, allocated, controlled. Nothing was wasted. Soldiers and civilians alike internalized this reality. You saved everything. You repaired everything. You made do with less because less was all there was. This was simply how things were. The German people had become accustomed to scarcity, and they assumed their enemies faced similar constraints. Werner Krebs had absorbed this worldview completely. He had grown up in a Germany recovering from the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the depression of the early 30s. He had come of age in a society where careful management of resources was a virtue and waste was a sin. His military service had reinforced these values. A good soldier took care of his equipment. A good officer ensured his men had what they needed through careful allocation and creative acquisition. Camp Shanks held approximately 5,000 German prisoners by January 1945. The facility, built on rolling hills overlooking the Hudson River, had originally served as a staging area for American troops deploying to Europe. Now it processed prisoners arriving from the European theater, conducting initial interrogations before transferring them to permanent camps across the United States. Werner Krebs had arrived on a Liberty ship that had carried 300 German POWs across the Atlantic. The voyage had taken 11 days. The prisoners were held in the cargo holds, supervised by American military police. The conditions were crowded but not deliberately harsh. They received 2 meals daily of bread, canned meat, and coffee, real coffee, not ersatz. The bread was white bread made from wheat flour, softer and lighter than the heavy dark bread German soldiers had been eating for years. Even this was notable. White bread required refined flour, which required processing capacity and fuel for milling. Dark bread, made from whole grain with minimal processing, was what Germany had been producing since 1939 to conserve resources. The quality of German military bread had declined throughout the war, as flour was stretched with potato flour, then with sawdust and other extenders. By 1944, German bread rations often contained only 50% actual grain. But the bread on the ship was just the beginning. Upon arrival at Camp Shanks, prisoners were processed through a receiving station. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and documented. Then they were taken to shower facilities. The showers themselves were remarkable. Hot water on demand. Soap, actual soap made from real fats, not the ersatz soap made from clay and chemicals that German soldiers had been using. Clean towels for every man. After showering, each prisoner received new clothing. Not German uniforms with POW markings, but American-made garments. A cotton undershirt, cotton underwear, wool trousers, a wool shirt, a field jacket, and boots,
new boots, sized to fit each man individually. The boots were made from genuine leather, properly constructed, with rubber soles that showed no signs of ersatz materials or poor craftsmanship. Werner Krebs held the boots in his hands and examined them carefully. The stitching was even and tight. The leather was supple, properly tanned. The soles were thick, real rubber with deep treads. These were better boots than he had been issued when he first joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, before the war, when German equipment was still of pre-war quality. He asked the American sergeant distributing the clothing why prisoners were being given new boots. The sergeant, who spoke some German, looked at him as if the question made no sense. "Your boots were worn out," the sergeant said. "We don't keep worn-out boots." This exchange stayed with Krebs. The casual certainty in the sergeant's voice, the assumption that worn boots would simply be replaced, no discussion of repair, no mention of making do, just the straightforward statement that worn boots would not be kept. It suggested a logistics system so abundant that repair was not worth the effort. The food at Camp Shanks reinforced this impression. Prisoners received 3 meals daily. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal or cornmeal porridge, bread with butter, jam, and coffee. Lunch and dinner included meat, vegetables, bread, and occasionally dessert. The portions were adequate, sometimes generous. The variety was remarkable. Different vegetables appeared throughout the week. The meat was sometimes beef, sometimes pork, sometimes chicken. There was fresh milk. German soldiers, even frontline troops, had not eaten this well since the early years of the war. The Wehrmacht's ration by 1944 consisted primarily of bread, ersatz coffee, occasional canned meat, and preserved vegetables. Fresh meat was rare. Fresh milk was nearly non-existent except in dairy regions. Butter had been replaced with margarine made from coal derivatives and other synthetic fats. Jam was made with beet sugar and artificial flavoring. But here, as prisoners of war, German soldiers ate better than they had as combat troops. This fact was discussed extensively in the barracks. Some men suggested the Americans were fattening them up for propaganda purposes to show the Red Cross that prisoners were well treated. Others argued that this was simply how Americans ate, that this abundance was normal for them. A few men, those who had been captured earlier and had spent more time in American camps, confirmed that the food remained consistent. This was not special treatment. This was standard. The salvage pile appeared every Thursday morning. Guards would designate an area near the supply warehouse where equipment deemed unserviceable would be collected. Throughout the week, items accumulated. By Thursday afternoon, a truck would arrive to haul everything away. Werner Krebs began watching this ritual with obsessive attention. The first Thursday after his arrival, he watched from the exercise yard as American soldiers brought items to the pile. A private carried an armload of wool blankets. The blankets had small holes, moth damage perhaps, but were otherwise intact. In Germany, these would have been patched and returned to service. Here they went on the pile. A corporal added several pairs of combat trousers with torn knees. The tiers were repairable, but apparently repair was not considered worthwhile. A sergeant brought a wooden crate filled with what looked like mess kits. Krebs asked a guard why the mess kits were being discarded. The guard explained that they were dented and the regulations required replacement. Dented. Not broken, not unusable, just dented. In the Wehrmacht, Krebs had eaten from the same mess kit for 4 years. The kit was dented, scratched, and discolored from thousands of meals cooked over field stoves. But it functioned, so he kept it. The boots arrived in the second hour. 2 soldiers carried boxes of boots to the pile. Krebs moved closer to the fence to see better. The boots were worn, certainly. The leather showed creases and scuff marks. But they were not destroyed. They were not beyond repair. They were simply worn enough that replacement was deemed more efficient than repair. One soldier noticed Krebs watching and walked over to the fence. "You interested in boots?" the soldier asked in rough German. Krebs nodded. "Those boots," he said, pointing to the pile, "they could be repaired." The American soldier shrugged. "Probably, but we got plenty of new ones. Why waste time fixing old ones?" If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Why waste time? Those 3 words contained an entire economic philosophy that was alien to everything Werner Krebs understood. You didn't waste time repairing boots because new boots were abundant enough that replacement was more efficient than repair. The calculation was purely economic. Labor time was more valuable than the boots themselves. This meant boots were cheap and labor was expensive, which was the exact opposite of the German situation where boots were precious and labor was cheap. Feldwebel Müller joined Krebs at the fence. They watched in silence as more items were added to the pile. Field jackets with broken zippers, canteens with dents, entrenching tools with bent handles, tent sections with small tiers. Every item was damaged, but every item was repairable. In the Afrika Korps, Müller explained, his unit had maintained a workshop where soldiers repaired equipment during rest periods. They had salvaged parts from destroyed vehicles to keep other vehicles running. They had patched uniforms until the patches needed patches. They had resoled boots with leather cut from captured British equipment. "I watched our cobbler repair a boot," Müller said, using leather from a boot that was beyond repair, rubber from a destroyed tire, and thread he'd unraveled from a torn tent. It took him 3 hours. At the end, we had 1 functioning boot. Here, they throw away boots that need an hour of work and issue new ones. A third prisoner, Obergefreiter Karl Schmidt, had been listening. Schmidt had been captured at Aachen in October 1944. He had spent 2 months in American custody, first at a forward camp in Belgium, then at Camp Shanks. "You haven't seen anything yet," Schmidt said. "Wait until you see what they do with food." The next morning at breakfast, Krebs paid attention to what happened after the meal ended. Prisoners filed past collection barrels where they scraped their trays. Leftover food went into the barrels, not just small scraps, but substantial amounts. Half a piece of bread here, several spoonfuls of oatmeal there, a partially eaten apple. The food was collected, and Krebs learned from Schmidt, fed to pigs at a nearby farm. Edible food, food that men could eat, was being given to animals. In Germany, such waste would have been criminal, literally criminal. The Reich had laws against wasting food. Citizens could be fined or imprisoned for discarding edible food. Every scrap was to be saved, consumed, or properly composted. Restaurant owners were required to serve small portions to minimize waste. Household garbage was inspected to ensure no food was being thrown away unnecessarily. But here the Americans produced so much food that they could afford to feed surplus to livestock. The mathematical implications were staggering. To produce surplus food, you needed surplus agricultural capacity. To have surplus agricultural capacity, you needed abundant land, abundant labor, abundant fertilizer, abundant fuel for tractors, abundant transportation to move crops to processing facilities, and abundant processing capacity to turn crops into food. Every link in that chain had to have excess capacity. The interrogations began in the second week. Military intelligence officers interviewed prisoners systematically, trying to extract information about German units, dispositions, and capabilities. Werner Krebs was called for his interrogation on a Tuesday morning. The interrogation room was in the administration building, a heated room with comfortable chairs and good lighting. The interrogator was a captain who spoke fluent German with a Bavarian accent. He introduced himself as Captain Weber, originally from Munich, emigrated to America in 1936. Captain Weber followed standard procedure, asking about Krebs's unit, his service history, his knowledge of German defenses. Krebs provided minimal information, nothing beyond what was required under the Geneva Convention: name, rank, serial number, date of birth. The captain didn't press hard. After perhaps 20 minutes of desultory questioning, Weber's tone changed. He became conversational, almost friendly. "Tell me," Weber said, "what surprises you most about America?" Krebs hesitated, then decided honesty was harmless. "The waste," he said. "You throw away equipment that could be repaired. You discard food that could be eaten. In Germany, such behavior would be criminal." Weber nodded slowly. "We're not wasting it," he said. "We're replacing it. There's a difference. Waste would be if we had limited boots and we destroyed them unnecessarily. We don't have limited boots. We have more boots than we need. So we replace worn boots with new boots, and we recycle the old ones for their materials." "But the labor to repair them," Krebs began. Weber interrupted gently. "The labor to repair them costs more than the boots themselves. An American worker's time is valuable. If he spends 3 hours repairing a pair of boots, that's 3 hours he's not producing new boots, not making aircraft parts, not welding ship hulls. We gain more by having him produce new things than by having him repair old things." This explanation was economically logical, but psychologically difficult to accept. It implied that American productivity was so high that labor was the bottleneck, not materials. In Germany, materials were the bottleneck. You had workers, you had time, but you didn't have leather or rubber or steel. So you used your workers to repair and reuse what materials you had. The American system was inverted. They had materials but limited labor time, so they used materials freely and conserved labor. Weber continued. "Let me give you some numbers. America produced 1.3 million tons of synthetic rubber in 1944. 1.3 million tons. How much did Germany produce?" Krebs didn't know the figure. "About 100,000 tons, Weber said. "We produced 13 times more. We also imported natural rubber from South America. We have so much rubber that we can put thick rubber soles on every soldier's boots. When the soles wear out, we replace the boots rather than resole them, because we have unlimited rubber but limited cobbler time." The numbers continued. Steel production. America produced 80 million tons in 1944. Germany produced 28 million tons. Aluminum production. America produced 1.3 million tons. Germany produced 250,000 tons. Oil production. America produced 4.7 million barrels per day. Germany produced synthetic fuel equivalent to about 30,000 barrels per day, and had access to Romanian oil fields producing another 200,000 barrels daily. The ratio was more than 10 to 1. "We're not being wasteful," Weber said. "We're being efficient. We allocate our resources to maximize production. Materials are cheap, labor is expensive, so we use materials freely and conserve labor. You allocate your resources differently because your situation is different. Materials are expensive, labor is relatively cheap, so you use labor to conserve materials. Both approaches are rational given the constraints, but our constraints are very different from yours." Werner Krebs returned to the barracks troubled. The conversation had reframed everything he had been observing. What looked like waste was actually a symptom of abundance. The discarded boots weren't evidence of American carelessness. They were evidence of American industrial capacity so vast that replacement was cheaper than repair. That night, he discussed the interrogation with Mueller and Schmidt. Schmidt had been through similar conversations with intelligence officers. "They want us to understand," Schmidt said. "They want us to know that Germany cannot win this war. They're showing us the numbers so we'll understand that continuing to fight is pointless." Mueller was less convinced. "Numbers can be propaganda," he said. "They can tell us they produce 80 million tons of steel, but how do we verify it?" Schmidt pointed at the camp around them. "Look at the evidence. Look at what we eat, what we wear, what they discard. Does this look like a nation that's straining its resources? We're prisoners, we're enemies, and they're feeding us better than our own army fed us. They're housing us in heated barracks with electric lights and indoor plumbing. They've given each of us new boots and new clothing. If they do this for prisoners, what do they do for their own soldiers?" The realization spread through the prisoner population at Camp Shanks like a slow-moving contagion. It wasn't a sudden mass conversion. It was a gradual, individual process as each man processed what he was seeing and reconciled it with what he had believed. Some prisoners resisted the conclusion. They argued that Camp Shanks was exceptional, that this abundance was staged for propaganda purposes, that the real America was struggling just as Germany was struggling. These men pointed to the strikes that had occurred in American coal mines, to the rationing that existed for American civilians, to the fact that the United States had instituted a draft because not enough men had volunteered. But the evidence accumulated daily. The Red Cross packages that arrived regularly, filled with cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, and soap. The medical care provided by American doctors using plentiful supplies of sulfa drugs and penicillin, medications that were desperately scarce in Germany. Saatchi camp library stocked with German-language books shipped from neutral countries, the sports equipment provided for recreation, the musical instruments available for prisoners who could play. Every detail spoke to surplus capacity, to resources deployed casually for non-essential purposes. Werner Krebs began keeping a mental inventory of waste, not because he enjoyed documenting American abundance, but because he couldn't stop noticing it. A work detail sent to clean the camp's administrative offices found waste paper baskets filled with paper that had writing on only one side. In Germany, paper was so scarce that official forms were printed on both sides, and every scrap was used completely. Here, paper was so abundant that partially used sheets were simply discarded. The guards' barracks had steam radiators that kept the buildings warm even in January. The heat was sometimes excessive, and guards would open windows to cool the rooms rather than adjust the radiators. Heating with such inefficiency implied unlimited coal. The camp's motor pool maintained dozens of vehicles, trucks, jeeps, staff cars. Mechanics worked on these vehicles constantly, but their work consisted primarily of preventive maintenance and replacing parts at scheduled intervals, not the desperate repairs that characterized German vehicle maintenance. When an engine needed rebuilding, mechanics didn't carefully disassemble it to salvage every usable part. They replaced the entire engine with a new one and sent the old engine back to a depot for professional rebuilding. The economics were the same as with the boots. Labor was too valuable to waste on field repairs when replacement parts were abundant. Feldwebel Müller, who had extensive experience with vehicle maintenance in the Africa Corps, found this particularly striking. In North Africa, his unit had kept vehicles running through cannibalization, taking parts from destroyed vehicles to repair damaged ones. They had cleaned and reused oil because new oil was unavailable. They had patched radiators with soap and sawdust to seal leaks. They had made gaskets from leather scraps. Every repair was an improvisation born of scarcity. American mechanics didn't improvise because they didn't need to. They had parts, tools, and materials in abundance. They followed technical manuals that specified exactly which parts to replace at which intervals. The system was standardized, efficient, and utterly dependent on enormous industrial capacity supporting it. By February 1945, Werner Krebs had accepted what the evidence showed. Germany was losing the war because Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a long conflict against enemies who could outproduce it by an order of magnitude. The brave soldiers, the tactical brilliance, the superior training, none of it mattered when the other side could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. The Wehrmacht could destroy 10 American tanks, and the Americans would produce 20 more. The Luftwaffe could shoot down 50 bombers, and the Americans would build 100 more. U-boats could sink 1 million tons of shipping, and American shipyards would launch 2 million tons of new ships. The interrogation reports from Camp Shanks and other prisoner facilities were compiled by American military intelligence and analyzed for insights into German morale and strategic understanding. These reports documented a consistent pattern. German prisoners arriving in American custody experienced profound psychological shock when confronted with American material abundance. The shock was most intense among prisoners who had been in combat for years and who had experienced the progressive deterioration of German supplies firsthand. A report dated March 1945 from Camp Shanks noted that 73% of recently captured prisoners expressed surprise at the quality and quantity of American equipment and supplies. 46% explicitly stated that witnessing American abundance had changed their assessment of the war's likely outcome. 28% reported that they now believed Germany's cause was hopeless and that continued resistance would only prolong inevitable defeat. These percentages increased the longer prisoners remained in American custody and the more exposure they had to American operations. Intelligence officers found that the most effective propaganda wasn't traditional persuasion. It was simply allowing prisoners to observe. Let them see the supply convoys. Let them watch the equipment being unloaded. Let them notice what was discarded and what was kept. Let them calculate the implications themselves. Men who resisted direct argument were often convinced by simple observation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The psychological process followed a recognizable pattern. First came denial. The abundance was staged, temporary, propaganda. Then came rationalization. America was wealthy but soft, industrial but militarily incompetent, productive but strategically foolish. Then came recognition. The material disparity was real, it was enormous, and it was decisive. Finally came depression or resignation as the implications sank in. Germany could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with this level of industrial capacity. Werner Krebs reached this final stage in late February. He wrote a letter to his brother, still serving somewhere on the Eastern Front, though Krebs didn't know where. The letter would be censored and might never arrive, but he wrote it anyway. He described the camp, the food, the equipment. He described the boots on the salvage pile. He wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word, but he tried to convey the essential truth. "We were told America was weak," he wrote. "We were told American soldiers were cowardly and American industry was inefficient. We were told that German quality would overcome American quantity. But the quantity is so vast that quality becomes irrelevant. They replace rather than repair because they can afford to replace. They have so much that waste is economically rational. I don't know if this letter will reach you. If it does, know that the situation is not what we were told." The letter was indeed censored. American intelligence removed the specific descriptions of equipment and supplies, concerned that detailed information might somehow be useful to German intelligence. but they allowed the general sentiment to pass. Letters from prisoners describing American abundance served American interests by potentially demoralizing German soldiers who received them. The letter never reached Krebs's brother. By the time it was processed and sent, the Eastern Front had collapsed. Krebs's brother had died in the fighting around Breslau in March 1945. Krebs wouldn't learn this until after the war ended. Other prisoners processed the realization differently. Some became cooperative, providing detailed information to interrogators in the belief that ending the war quickly would save lives. Some became bitter, angry at German leadership for leading them into an unwinnable war while lying about the strategic situation. Some became resigned, settling into the routine of camp life and waiting for the war to end. And some remained defiant, clinging to the hope that German wonder weapons or Soviet-American political tensions would somehow change the war's trajectory. But even the defiant ones couldn't deny what they observed daily. The abundance was real. The waste was real. The industrial capacity it represented was real. One prisoner, an ardent Nazi who refused to cooperate with interrogators and maintained his faith in ultimate German victory, was overheard telling another prisoner, "Even if we lose this war, at least we fought. At least we tried. But yes, they have more than we ever imagined. More than anyone could have imagined." When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners at Camp Shanks listened to the news broadcasts in stunned silence. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. The news was received with a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for what had been lost, for what Germany had become, for the millions dead in a war that had achieved nothing but destruction. Werner Krebs sat in the barracks that evening thinking about the boots. It seemed absurd that something so mundane had been the catalyst for his understanding. Not a military defeat, not a strategic analysis, not a political argument, but simply watching American soldiers discard worn boots because they had unlimited replacements. That single observation had contained within it the entire truth of Germany's strategic situation. Germany was fighting a war it could not win against enemies whose productive capacity was so vast that they could afford to waste resources Germany desperately hoarded. The post-war investigations and historical analyses would confirm what Krebs had realized in that prisoner camp. American industrial production during World War II was extraordinary by any historical standard. The United States produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. American factories built 300,000 aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, 7 million rifles, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. American shipyards launched 5,000 cargo ships, 1,000 warships, and tens of thousands of landing craft. This production occurred while the United States simultaneously supplied the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, providing 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, 15 million pairs of boots, and 4 million tons of food. The numbers were so large they became almost meaningless. But the boots on the salvage pile at Camp Shanks made the numbers concrete and comprehensible. 15 million pairs of boots shipped to the Soviet Union meant that America could produce boots so abundantly that equipping an entire foreign army was feasible. The discarded boots at the camp meant that America could afford to treat boots as disposable items rather than precious resources. Everything flowed from that fundamental abundance. German prisoners were gradually repatriated over the following years. Werner Krebs remained at Camp Shanks until July 1945, then was transferred to a camp in Georgia where he worked on agricultural labor details. He was finally repatriated to Germany in April 1946. He returned to a country devastated by war, its cities bombed to rubble, its economy shattered, its population traumatized. The Germany he had left in 1939 no longer existed. Krebs settled in Stuttgart and found work as a clerk. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service or his time as a prisoner, but he kept a diary in his later years written for his grandchildren, trying to explain what the war had been like and what he had learned from it. In that diary, he returned repeatedly to the theme of material disparity and its psychological impact. "We were taught that will and spirit could overcome material disadvantage," he wrote. "We were taught that German discipline and organization would defeat Allied chaos and waste. These were lies, or at best, dangerous half-truths. Will matters. Spirit matters. But when the material disparity is 10-1 or 20-1, will and spirit are not enough. I learned this watching American soldiers throw away boots. Those boots contained a lesson about power, about industry, about the kind of war we were fighting and why we could not win it." Feldwebel Müller survived the war and returned to his hometown in Bavaria. He opened a small repair shop, fixing shoes and leather goods. His shop became known for its quality work and reasonable prices. He would repair anything, no matter how worn, believing that the skills he had learned keeping equipment functional in the Afrika Korps should be put to peacetime use. He lived until 1983, long enough to see Germany reunified, economically, with West Germany becoming one of the world's wealthiest nations. Before he died, he told his son about his time as a prisoner in America, about the abundance he had witnessed, about the boots on the salvage pile. "We lost the war," he said, "long before we knew we were losing. We lost it in the factories, in the shipyards, in the industrial capacity we never had and could never build. The fighting was just the process by which this reality became undeniable." The story of German prisoners discovering American abundance through mundane observations like discarded boots is documented in numerous interrogation reports, prisoner memoirs, and post-war historical studies. It represents a small but significant chapter in understanding how wars are won not just on battlefields but in factories, how material capacity shapes strategic possibilities, and how soldiers on both sides came to understand the true nature of industrial warfare. The boots were just boots, but they were also proof of everything the Wehrmacht had been told to disbelieve about American strength. And for the men who saw them discarded as trash, who picked through salvage piles in disbelief, who tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught, those boots represented the moment when illusion met reality, and reality won decisively. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.